Hello, everyone. I am Jewel Davis, Chair of the North Carolina Library Association's Roundtable for Ethnic Minority Concerns. Welcome to our second webinar in our May Culture Conversation series. Before we get started, I just want you to know there is a chat box that you have access to. We'll be taking your questions and comments in the chat box today. So our session for today focuses on introducing you to African American genealogy. I am excited to introduce our speaker today, Marcellus A. Joyner. He is the supervising librarian for the Heritage Research Center for the High Point Public Library in North Carolina, as well as the archivist for the High Point Museum. His main area of focus is to coordinate collaborative efforts between the museum and research center to create and implement digitization initiatives to facilitate online access to local history and genealogy materials. He holds a BA in history from North Carolina A&T State University and a Master's of Library Science degree from North Carolina Central University. Marcellus is currently a member of the Society of American Archivists, the American Library Association, the North Carolina Library Association, and the Society of North Carolina Archivists. He most recently served on the State Historical Records Advisory Board and currently serves on the Advisory Board for Digital Library of American Slavery at the University of North Carolina at Greensboro. Thank you, Marcellus, for joining us, and welcome.
Thank you, Jill. Thank you for the introduction. And I'd just like to say hello to everyone and let's dive right in. Researching your African American roots. So why do we need to preserve our family history? We do this to recover and preserve our past, to connect with family members that we never knew we had, to leave a legacy to our descendants, as well as establish a sense of connection between you and past generations. As I talk about my own experiences and my own journey doing genealogy, it's been a wealth of resources and information that have come my way, things that I never knew about my family. I can speak more specifically about my mother's father, who didn't really talk much about his family from Chesterfield, South Carolina. Matter of fact, we never knew he had such an extensive family, but through doing research and through doing genealogy, we've connected with a wealth of family on that side. As a matter of fact, we just had a very large family reunion, close to 300 people, to take place this past August. So when you think about preserving your family history or embarking on genealogy, there is no limits to the things you can find and things that you can discover. Now, things to get you started. Typically, in our department, if you're approaching this as a novice, we like to start people out with creating a pedigree chart. And what a pedigree chart is basically, it's a straight line genealogy trace from yourself to your parents, parents, so on and so forth, as far back as you can do research on until you hit a wall. And typically at that point, we turn people towards our other chart, which is a family chart, which is more extensive. It names not only the parents, but brothers and sisters, aunts and uncles, outlaws and in-laws, so to speak. And generally, we try to cater to people's mode of doing research. Everybody's not tech savvy, so if you're still a note taker or like to write things down, we encourage people to keep their notes that way. Some are a little more tech savvy. So if you're more tech savvy, we tend to point you to a lot of the databases now that let you create family trees online. So let's progress to the next slide, where I'm going to show you an example of a pedigree chart. Here's a pedigree chart, and as I mentioned before, it's a straight line trace of your parents' parents, so on and so forth. So this is my personal one here, and it's about a 4-generation trace from myself. So it's like I said before, it's just a straight line trace as far back as you can go. This was actually done a little while ago, so I've gotten a little further back on some of those great grandparents on the 5th line. Kind of broke through some brick walls. So let's move on to the next slide. The next slide is more so of a family chart, and this was done through my personal account on myheritage.com. And as you can see, it's not a straight line trace. It has brothers and sisters, aunts and uncles, as many people as you want to add. It describes a multitude of relationships, even those that aren't traditional, so to speak. But it is an all-encompassing way to document your family. So what are some of the resources that we use? One of the top resources is the more senior members of your family. But I've also discovered through doing my own family research that though your senior members are your go-to, you want to also talk to those family members who visit a lot, who go to the family reunions, who how can I put it? I guess the movers and shakers of the family, so to speak. They kind of get the place to place. So the elderly are your go-to, but you want to kind of talk to everybody in your family when it comes to doing your family research. Old family Bibles. At the turn of the century and during the 1800s, a lot of people trace their families in the family Bibles, documenting deaths, births, and marriages. I want to say that it's probably some families that still do it now, but I kind of think it's a dying art. Old photographs are always good. There may be a family member. If you go back and look at some of those old photographs, it may be someone in there that you don't recognize that some of your family members may be able to identify. Marriage licenses. Marriage licenses are typically name the bride and groom, the mother and father, where the bride and groom got married, where the mother and father were living at the time, and whether they were living or deceased. Birth certificates tend to list the mother and father and the child and the city, state, what have you, where they were born in. Death certificates often list the mother and father, but it's not always the case. Birth certificates typically are troublesome sometimes, depending on who was the informant on the death certificate. If the informant wasn't knowledgeable about the person, or as knowledgeable as you would like for them to be, sometimes death certificates may have some misinformation. Church records. Church records are good, but it varies from it varies between denominations sometimes. So some keep a little better records than others. Census records, libraries, and the internet are also great resources when starting out your journey on tracing your family history. 20th century research. Typically, most people, including African Americans, can trace their family back to the turn of the century. This can be done specifically through these four resources: oral histories, census records, death certificates, and birth certificates. Well, just give me a second. Now, the next couple of slides I'm going to show you is actually a couple of census records dealing specifically with my father's mother's side of the family, the Neals. And before I start out on that, I just wanted to give you a bit of this information. The 1940 census record is the most recent census that that has been released. Census records are only released every 72 years, and there is a mandatory waiting period before it is released. So the 1950 records will not be released until 2022. So I chose to start out tracing my father's mother's family first because she was the grandparent I knew the least about. She died at the age of 38, well before I was born. So, you know, she was sort of a mystery, and the rest of her family. So when I was hired here as a supervisor, we thought it would be a good idea for me to begin tracing my family history as a way of being able to help patrons when they came to visit. So it took me a little while, but I discovered my grandmother Eva's death certificate, which named my great grandfather, Grover Giles Neal, and it took me a little while to find his certificate as well. But when I finally did discover it, it gave me the name of my second great grandfather and great grandmother, Adeline and John. So the next couple of slides will pertain to the Neal family. Here in the 1930 census, we have my great grandmother, Adeline, who at this time, I should have mentioned that we will be working our way backwards with these census records. So here is Adeline, who is now widowed and living with a couple of her children. And I'm going to kind of speed through these a little bit, just so we can have some questions. If you have any questions about the census records at the end, we can come back to them. Here's the 1920 census with Adeline and my great-great-grandfather, John. This is before he passed away. Here's in 1910 with my great-grandfather, Grover. Now, at this time, he's listed as 11. So, of course, the 1920 census that I showed you just a second ago, he had left the home early, approximately around 19, 20 years old. So he was out on his own at this time. So that's why he's not listed in the 1920 and 1930 census record with the rest of the family. And 1900 with the family once again. And this is Greene County, Georgia, if I hadn't mentioned it before. So general roadblocks in genealogy research, and this pertains not to just African Americans, but to everyone. The 1890 to 1899 census record were the original data for the 1890 census is no longer available. Almost all population schedules were damaged in the fire in the basement of the Commerce Building in Washington, D.C. in 1921. And at this point, it's very unlikely. Most people who go on this genealogy adventure or journey, there's very little information for this particular census period. I think the statistic is that probably about 15% of the population would actually have any family members that would trace to what survives from what was burned in the Commerce Building. So it's a very big hole so to speak, when it comes to genealogy research in the United States for the 1890 census in particular. Other issues or other strong roadblocks for genealogists is surname variations. As we see in the example, there are 4 different variations of how my surname or last name was spelled in the research that I've done. The most common one is Joyner, Joyner, J-O-I-N-E-R and J-O-Y-N-E-R. But there were a few instances where my family dropped the I, or someone or the census record taker listed them as a Joyner or Jones. The use of different names by the same person in multiple census records. People always didn't go by their first name. Sometimes they use their middle name or even nicknames. So it makes it difficult sometimes when the name doesn't quite match. But the trick is to pay attention to people who are living in the home and those who are living in very close proximity to that family member. Multiple results in the same with the same name, and that goes for both searching family names on databases online, as well as doing the research in the stacks as well, because people like to use names a lot, or you see names repeated repeatedly. I could think of an example of for a branch of my family where there was a Wade Sanders who was a very prominent farmer in Newberry County, South Carolina in the early 1800s. And he had 7 or 8 children, and each one of those children named a child after their father. So the name Wade Sanders comes up a lot in different records for Newberry County, South Carolina. It made it very difficult to sort them out, but it just took some time to kind of weed through people of the same names. And sometimes ancestors just don't show up in the census records. Some families stayed in very, very rural areas. Some people were kind of untrusting of people coming to their homes, taking records, or just kind of showing up out the blue. So sometimes family members don't show up on census record because they just chose not to participate. Conflicting information in documents, that happens quite often. Inability to find both parents, places of birth too vague. And I have an example of that for one of my great grandfathers, Spencer Glover. Spencer Glover was born in 1856 in Savannah, Georgia, or at least that's what his death certificate says. But his census records say that he was born, he and his father were born both in Virginia. So you have two government documents that have conflicting information on it. And sometimes the documents are just illegible. As time goes on, these original materials begin to degenerate. So for some documents, it just may be impossible to make out the information that's contained on them. So bridging the gap for the from 1880 to the 1900s. Although the census records for 1890 were destroyed, it's not totally impossible to connect the 1880 census to the 1900 census. What I typically advise people on is to take a look at your family, if you've found them in the 1800 census, and pay very close attention to the children who are preteens or very young teenagers. Locate your family in the 1900 census and you should see some of those same children within the home. So that's the one trick, or the major way of getting over that 1890 gap. Just tracing a lot of the children who were in the home to the early 1900s. And typically, in the 1800s and 1900s, people didn't move around as much. They stayed put a little bit more, and a lot of children did not move out the home if they weren't married. So that's the typical trick to get over that 20-year gap. So we're now looking at the 1880 census, and my great-great-grandfather John and his wife Adeline are living in Greene County, Georgia. Next to them is a woman named Zilphy Ann Neal. And for a long time, I was not able to find John Neal's death certificate. So I had no idea, or didn't have any indication whether Zilphy was a relative or not. But I eventually found it and found that Zilphy was listed as his mother. Don't know if it's visible, but her name is actually spelled Zashan on here. So that goes back to the example of names being incorrect or spelled incorrectly, as well as on John Neal's death certificate, Zilphy is the only parent name. So that's an example of a parent, the other parent not being listed on the death certificate for one reason or another. So eventually I discovered the 1870 census, and here we see that Zilphy and John are living in the same household along with John's other brothers and sisters. So that confirmed that she was indeed John's mother. So from freedom to slave. The years from 1860 to 1865 can be problematic for the African American researcher. Slaves aren't listed on the free schedule of the 1860 census. They are listed by name. They are not listed by name in any pre-1870 census schedule. Slavery ends in 1865. So where did your family go? Who owned your ancestor? And did they use the same name after slavery that they used while they were in bondage? What's your next move, or what to do next? You have to identify the slave master. So typically, you'll look at the 1870 census, and while you're searching the 1870 census, you're looking for white farm owners or neighbors who have a large amount of property. And I have to admit that at first, looking at the 1870 census and looking at the property value of the property that my family had, I thought these were independent farms. But if you look at a census record from the 1870s and 1880s, and you see that there are white neighbors who have land that is significantly more valuable than their African American neighbors, that's more of an indication of sharecropping. So you want to look for that pattern and match up whatever your family surname whatever surname your family has in the 1870 census. You want to see if there's a white family who has the same name. Sometimes it's not that easy. Sometimes the family African Americans change their name afterwards, but you still want to look for a white neighbor who has a lot of farmland in close proximity to your relatives. So the slave schedule was a substitute or a tally of the amount of slaves that a slave master had. Slave schedules existed for only the 1850 and 1860 census. Slaves were listed under the master's name only, and they were only described by age, sex, and color. This is an example of a slave schedule from the 1860s, and this is William Neal's listing of slaves. So as I did my comparison, I did discover that William Neal, who has the same name, surname as my family, lived in very close proximity in 1870. So I began seeking out his slave schedule. One interesting thing, or a very interesting thing that I saw, is that he had slaves who were described as either black or mulatto on both pages. So looking at the 1870 census and looking at how my family was described in the 1870 census, they were listed as mulatto. So I began comparing my family members in the 1876s for Greene County, Georgia, to William Neal's 1860 slave schedule, and found that they matched up very, very evenly, and with a few variations in age, but very close enough not to be way off. So I was able to identify 4 of my family members on his slave schedule, with my great-great-aunt Betsy, my great-great-grandfather John, my great-great-great-grandmother Zilphy, and my great-aunt Elizabeth. 1850, William Neal was not quite on his own, so I did discover that there was a gentleman named Older Neal living in very close proximity to the area. And after doing a little extensive research, found that Older Neal is actually William Neal's father. Now the ages don't quite match up as smoothly as they did from 1870 to 1860, but and this is only speculation, I'm still not quite sure about this, but I believe that the woman listed here, the slave listed here in the 1850 census on the second page would be my great-great-grandmother Sylvia. So 1790 to 1840 census. Census records prior to 1850 listed the slave master and the slave on the same document. Only the head of household or the slave owner is identified by name. All household members were identified by age group, sex, whether they were a slave, a free person of color, or a free white person. So let's take a look at the 1840 census. Here we have Older Neal, who's listed as the head of household. And for the 1840 census, going back to when census were created in I think the earliest one is the 1820, 1820, I believe. Here in the first column, you have males who are listed as free white persons, including heads of families. And it has a breakdown from age 5 all the way through 100 in the different columns. So this is how you would list the other family members beside the head of household. So here we have Older Neal, who would have been between the age of 50 and 60, and William, who would have been between the age of 20 and 30. Also listed is William Neal's wife and his daughter. As we move to the next page, we have the tally of everyone who lived on William Neal's farm. So we have William Neal living with his father, older Neal, his mother and sister in the 1840 census. And if you minus those four, the rest of the people who are total on this part of the census record would be, the remainder would be his slaves. So records that I've used, and this is for not just for the Neal side of my family, but just all four branches. We have used court records from my mother's side, specifically for one of her great-grandmothers who had quite a few children, but there seemed to be not a man there to raise them, so she apprenticed all of her children out very young, and it's listed in the Pierson County court records of North Carolina. Wills, marriage bonds, apprenticeship bonds, as well as pre- and post-slavery newspapers. So what records should you see? Bastardy records or bastardy bonds, Bible collections, breeding records, church records, diaries, insurance policies, plantation records, slave cohabitation records, and slave ship records. Freedmen's Bureau records as well. Southern Claims Commission records, U.S. Colored Troops Service records, federal pensions of military service, court records, runaway notices, bills of sale, and deed books, as well as loose estate records of masters, which include inventory, sales, and divisions of property, including slaves. So, as I traveled on this genealogy journey, the more I did research in Greene County, Georgia, I began to run into other researchers who were researching the same family. And one thing I noticed, one thing that was very consistent is there were other researchers who would trace William Neal, but may not list his family, or he was absent from some researchers' family trees. So I began reaching out to different researchers on Ancestry.com, and I spoke with a gentleman who will remain nameless because I don't have permission to use his name for the webinar's purpose. But he did inform me or tell me that William Neal never married anyone of his own race. My great-great-grandmother Zilphy never did either. So he confirmed that the children of Zilphy Neal were William Neal's children, and it's a good indication of why John may have not listed his father's name on his death certificate. And this was only, this was confirmed researcher to researcher, but I later had my father's DNA tested and found a researcher who also is a descendant of William Neal and his family, and my father and the researcher's DNA match up. So bridging 7 generations from William Neal to my young nephew Evan, I think there's a very strong family resemblance. I hope you enjoyed the webinar, and if you have any questions, I will open the floor up or the internet up now.
Thank you so much, Marcellus. So I've got Anaya on chat, and we're waiting to see if anyone has any questions. And start with the first question. Can you repeat what you said about what pointed you towards your ancestor being a sharecropper?
If you look very closely in the 1870 census, if the person has traced their family back that far, they usually there is a very large gap between the amount of property that larger plantation owners may have had and sharecroppers may have had. So it may just look like that sharecrop, that plantation owner is your neighbor, but if you go to the property value section of the census record and make the comparison, usually the plantation owner or farm owner has a more significant amount of land value compared to your relatives. Your relatives is going to be fairly small, and it's an indication of sharecropping because he's allowing them to stay on his land, and that land value that your family member has, it's just an indication of how much that land is worth, but it doesn't mean that it belongs to your family member. More than likely, they're sharecropping. Did that answer their question?
She said yes.
Okay. All right.
Another one, you mentioned you use myheritage.com. Any other specific sites besides the census?
You said sites or?
So I believe she's asking, are there any other genealogy sites that you might recommend?
Yes. Family Search is good. If you're not planning on spending any money, or if you don't want to spend any money starting out on the research, Family Search is good. It's offered through the Church of Latter-day Saints. They allow you to create a free account, and you can build your family tree, and there's no limit on how many people you can add. There's something about the Church of Latter-day Saints that they're very, how can I put it? Genealogy is their thing. To put it simple, is their thing. So this is a service they offer for free. Also, you can build a tree for free on ancestry.com, and that's unlimited, but you won't be able to save the supporting documents that will pop up. You know how they say on the commercial that if a leaf pops up, excuse me, that if you're doing a free tree on Ancestry, you will not be able to save the documents to your relative's profile, but you will be able to grow your tree without any how can I put it? You can. There's no limit on how many people that you can add. And I typically use different websites all simultaneously because sometimes I tend to find information on others that I can't find on some, if that makes any sense.
Another question is, did you find that the online resources were more or less accurate or helpful than those related to birth and death and marriage records?
I would say yes. For the majority of the research I've done on my family, it's been accurate. There's very few that I've come across where there was that it was different than what's listed in a book that I might find that's on a particular county, like like a cemetery record book. And it may just be for me, because everybody's journey is different when it comes to genealogy. It just depends on where your family came from and their stories. So places where I may not have had difficulties in doing research, other people's might. Did that answer the question?
We'll wait to see if she types something in, but while we're waiting, I'll give you another question.
Well, before you move on, if that didn't clear it up for her, she's welcome. Everybody's welcome to send me an email if something's not covered during the chat.
And she responded, yes, thank you.
Okay.
And then any guidance on researching descendants from the Caribbean region? It appears as if one has to go through the British archives.
Wow. I have not actually had the experience of helping someone from the Caribbean with their research, but I would love to dive into that. That person can contact me directly. I'm willing to help them or dive into it, but I just haven't helped anyone from the Caribbean with their research yet.
Great. And someone did respond, trying family search. There are a lot of records online for that area too, but this speaker or participant who asked the question said that they'll contact you.
Okay.
Another question, if you can perhaps speak to this, how accurate is DNA testing by the various sites?
Woo. Well, I will say this. Okay, so I've had experience with family tree DNA. I've tested both my mother and father for family tree DNA. I've also tested my wife's uncle for ancestry. And just my experience that the DNA is very accurate because I have the research documentation to back up some of the matches. Now, some people, you have so many matches that show up. You may not be able to. You're not going to be able to talk to them all. Everybody's not going to respond. People come on these sites for different reasons. But I will say I've had the most success on my mother's side. As I stated earlier in the webinar, at the beginning of the webinar, we just had a very large family reunion this past August, where it's about 300 of us, and that was through a DNA match. Like 3 or 4 of us, it is happenstance or serendipity that 3 or 4 cousins who never knew each other were all online doing research, family research, and DNA tested, and we all show up as like second or third cousins. So I would say it's very accurate, to answer the question.
Great. So going back to the Caribbean research, someone else responded, there's also material on ancestry.com. And then we have another question. I've connected the dots to build my family's history. How can I verify it when the relatives aren't there to ask?
Okay. That is a loaded question. So is she talking about like branches of people that she doesn't know, or her like senior people that she does have? And I'm assuming that this is a she. I'm sorry. Senior persons in this person's family. If they don't know them, sometimes you just have to trust. You have to trust the documentation. you know, if you've done the work and connected the dots by documentation, it's probably time to do a DNA search, especially when you have branches of the family that seem to have branched off so far that some of the more senior family members that are in your immediate family don't know. Um, DNA helps connect the dots and sometimes bust up mysteries or myths within your family.
Great, and it looks like there's just one more asking about 23andMe. Do you have experience with that one, using that one?
I have not used 23andMe, but we actually have had a young lady who works with 23andMe in um, in Burlington. 23andMe actually has a lab in Burlington. So the young lady is a part of the African American Genealogical Historical Society, and she has given a talk for us, I believe, twice now. She would be probably the best person to ask, and if that person emails me, I can forward the email to her. I'm pretty sure she would have the answer for them.
Okay, great. It doesn't look like there's any more questions. Give you just a few seconds to write them in quickly if you have any.
All right. Well, while we're waiting, I just like to thank everybody for being patient with me during my very first webinar. I think I made it through without having a heart attack. So
You did a great job, Marcellus, and we are so appreciative of you taking the time to talk with us today. So we're going to go ahead and end, and thank you everyone who participated today. I will be in touch with you in the next few days with the recording and the chat transcript and the slides. So I hope you all have a great rest of the day. Thank you so much for being here.
thank you.